As someone with no regard for my personal safety or mental well-being, I recently opened Twitter. I know, terrible idea. And I saw there was some interesting discourse, this time on climate change. There were major arguments all around the issue of individual responsibility, i.e., do individuals have a duty or moral responsibility to take actions to reduce their own personal emissions, so as to combat climate change? Things like drive less, eat less meat, etc. The issue can often also be taken from a vegan perspective. Do individuals have a responsibility to not eat meat, whether it be for climate change reasons or just for individual ethics? It's undeniably an interesting question, and I saw many people arguing that individuals do indeed have a moral responsibility to reduce their own emissions, and if they don't, they're being immoral. I found a lot of these people very overconfident in the strength of their argument, often because there was little being presented in terms of counter-arguments. So that's what I'm here to do today. In turn, this will link into a lot of the rhetoric and arguments made from the vegan community, most notably Malvi Infidel, who makes a lot of very passionate statements around issues like climate change and meat eating. And before the vegans get mad at me, this is oat milk in this tea. So, ethical. So, in this video, we are going to explore the issue of individual responsibility when it comes to climate change. And to do this, I will first present an argument for individuals having a moral duty to reduce their own emissions, this being called Kutz's complicity principle. I will then present my own argument, which is that whilst it would be good for individuals to reduce their own emissions, they don't have a moral responsibility to do so. But they do have a responsibility to campaign for governments to take action against climate change. Now, I know that sounds a little bit weird and contradictory, but hear me out. And then, much like all good academic explorations of political philosophy, we will apply this to Twitter discourse. So basically, if you're only interested in that, skip to that section of the video. I would recommend sticking with the video to see these two theories, as it will play into a lot of how I sort of view this issue. But also, before we move on, it is important for you to know that considering these numbers on the screen right now, you have a moral responsibility to subscribe. Trust me. Can't. He would. And, who's the... Mill? He would as well, so, you should. Kutz's complicity principle. So let's start by presenting an argument for individuals having a responsibility to reduce their own emissions. And the argument I will be presenting is from a philosopher called Kutz, who argues for an individualistic account of responsibility for collective harms, like climate change, through what he calls the complicity principle. The complicity principle that Kutz presents argues that someone is accountable for what others do when they intentionally participate in the wrong they do or harm they cause. Meaning that, in practice, I am accountable for the harm or wrong we do together, independently of the actual difference that I make. This essentially equates to the most common argument we see on these sorts of issues, this being that one shouldn't be complicit or engage in actions that cause harm. Pretty simple and sounds pretty agreeable. To explain this in more depth, Kutz uses the example of a bombing attack made by a group of individuals. It is the case that no one bomber makes an individual difference, and no bomber has control over the total outcome. If any one of those involved had not carried out their action, as Kutz states, the firestorm would still have been raised, and therefore could any of them be held individually responsible for the casualties they caused collectively. Under the principle of complicity, each of these bombers, despite not drastically changing the outcome, are individually responsible for their collective damage. This, when applied to climate change, would suggest that individuals do indeed have a duty to live their personal lives in ways to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, as they would be responsible for the consequences of collective action that they engage in, irrespective of their personal impact. So, even though taking a short and leisurely drive has a minimal impact on the world ending, under the complicity principle, you are still responsible for the collective damage you have contributed to. However, it is important to recognize some of the limitations of Kutz's principle in applying to the issue of climate change. In the example of a bombing, those causing the collective harm are doing so intentionally. However, in terms of climate change, it is not the case that people intentionally participate in harmful acts. Instead, there are other goals in mind. In the case of, say, driving a car, someone isn't acting to release pollution into the air. Instead, they are driving somewhere for a purpose or for some utility. This would therefore suggest that the complicity principle can only apply to climate change in cases where people specifically intend to cause harm, which I imagine there are very few of, unless, I don't know, there's some sadomasochists out there who really love the idea of the world being on fire. But hey, I don't know, I'm not here to kink shame. Perhaps instead we disregard the intentional aspect from the complicity principle, meaning that any participation in a system which causes harm, regardless of how one perceives their action, is responsible for the collective damage, and therefore everyone has a duty to not participate. This would therefore allow us to apply this responsibility to climate change, and would once again argue that individuals have a duty to not participate in harmful systems. So at this point, we have an argument for individual responsibility when it comes to combating climate change. One must not participate in harmful systems, because if they do, they are responsible for the collective harm that is caused by this issue. To drive a car is to participate in the collective harm caused by cars in general, and therefore makes one individually responsible. However, some of the issues of this principle come about when we sort of consider the logical end to its argument. It could be the case that this principle goes even further than just don't eat meat or don't drive a car. For example, it is even possible that this complicity principle would impose a duty specifically to not campaign for governments to adopt climate-friendly policies, as this could, in theory, be a form of participation in a harmful system, i.e. the government producing greenhouse gas emissions in one form or another. Perhaps voting for a government which then produces emissions is participating in a harmful system, and would make you individually responsible. One might argue that the intention in this case would be to end these emissions, and could therefore be justified. However, in order to apply this argument to the issue of climate change, you may remember the consideration of intention had to be abandoned, and therefore any participation, be it well-meaning or not, in a collective harm makes you individually responsible. And much like a game of Twister with your family, this leaves us in an awkward position. Individuals would have a duty to minimize their greenhouse gas emissions by removing themselves from any systems which cause harm. However, individuals would also have a duty to not campaign or vote for governments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as this would be participating in a system which would produce greenhouse gases. I find this conclusion both unproductive and potentially contradictory to its aims. Individuals would have to reduce their own emissions, but they couldn't morally act collectively or politically in order to solve the broader problem. Clearly, this common argument we see in line with the complicity principle has several issues. Therefore, a different system of responsibility in order to define duty is needed. Young's social connection model. Finally, that boring, wrong argument is done. Time for my based and cool argument. This being based off of Young's social connection model. Instead of Kutz's individualistic approach, Young takes aim at what's called structural injustice. Young observes that structured social action and interaction often have collective results that no one intends, as a consequence of individuals and institutions acting in pursuit of their particular goals and interests, within rules and norms that are accepted and generally considered moral. For example, when I drive for my 8th McDonald's of the week, I don't mean to hurt the environment. It's simply an unintended consequence of behavior that we all deem to be normal and healthy. No, I don't have a problem. I'm a big fan of the McDonald's wraps. Everyone tell me down below your favorite McDonald's order. Vegans, I'm actually interested if they have options. Anyway, within this structural injustice, the actions of particular persons do not contribute to injustice directly, but rather indirectly, collectively, and cumulatively, through the mutual reinforcement and construction of structural constraints in society. Now, I know that sounds insanely complicated, but let's think about it in simple terms. It's simply arguing that society is structured or built in a way that incentivizes or even potentially necessitates the engagement with harmful systems for one's own personal gain. And actions that we take in these systems indirectly cause harm when added up with everyone else's. It isn't a huge deal when I drive for my 8th McDonald's, but when everyone's driving for their 8th McDonald's, because that's a totally normal thing for people to do, there is a large consequence at hand. Applying this to climate change, the structural injustice in question would be the various institutional and societal incentives or pressures to act within a fossil fuel-based economy, which produces large amounts of greenhouse gases for one's own personal advancement, be it working at a factory, driving to your job, or simply eating meat. As a left-wing person myself, we can talk about our most favourite industry in the world, the housing market. Homelessness is a very real problem within our current housing system, and Young observes that there are numerous structural factors influencing its organisation and harmful consequences, be it financial capacity, cultural assumptions, local planning policies, etc. In this case, our ability to analyse who caused this homelessness is very limited, as there is little causal responsibility for the structural injustice to be found when these different systems all impact the housing market to such a degree. Now once again, I know that sounds complicated, but think about it in terms of societal structures. There is very rarely a cause and effect to negative outcomes. There isn't some supervillain manufacturing homelessness. It's a structural issue, impacted and caused by many different factors, many of which are by no means nefarious or evil, but unintentionally and collectively lead to bad outcomes, like homelessness. This can equally be applied to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions as a structural injustice. This is because, in pursuing one's own innocent interests within our current society and economy, be it through meat consumption, fast food industry, or simply car travel, there are collective results that no one intends, and it can also be difficult in these cases to find any individual causal responsibility, due to no one individual's actions being necessary or sufficient for these unintended consequences. Necessary and sufficient are terms you'll hear a lot in studying philosophy, and especially when you're talking about cause and effect, but essentially it means that driving my car won't cause the end of the world, and the world could still end even if I don't. So am I really responsible? Young argues that individuals bear responsibility for structural injustices like homelessness within the housing market, or climate change, due to their contributions through actions within the processes that produce unjust outcomes. Despite a lack of intention or direct causal chain to these outcomes, individuals are responsible for these injustices, as we are part of the process. Technical jargon aside, this system of responsibility claims that by benefiting, or at least aiming to benefit, from systems which cause collective harm, we bear some responsibility over these collective consequences. This isn't to say that these consequences are your fault, but instead that we have a responsibility to fix or solve them. At this point, you may think that this model and Kutz's principle we saw earlier sounds slightly similar. However, it is important to acknowledge the differences between them, these being primarily seen with the content of the responsibility which they imply. Whilst Kutz's principle can be slightly vague and awkward in what it makes us responsible to do, as well as specifically targeting individuals, Young very clearly outlines the duty of her system. This duty being explained through 5 different features, these being as follows. Number 1, much like anti-vaxxers, it is not isolating, meaning it's not focusing on specific individuals and their actions. 2, judging background conditions, meaning the focus on structures incentivizing behavior rather than behavior itself. 3, it's more forward-looking than backward-looking, i.e. it cares more about how we're going to solve the problem rather than who's to blame. 4, shared responsibility. And 5, discharged only through collective action. These 5 features help to define the social connection model, and this conception of responsibility as a collective and shared one, focusing upon the structures which cause behavior rather than the individuals behaving in this manner specifically. From this model, we can demonstrate that individuals do not have a duty to lead their personal lives in ways that seek to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, but they do have a duty to campaign for governments to adopt climate-friendly policies. As feature 5 presents, these systems and structures that incentivize collectively harmful action can only be ended through collective action, and this responsibility consists in changing the institutions and processes so that their outcomes will be less unjust. Young acknowledges that these problems are structural ones, and then therefore they can only be solved on a structural level. This in effect, as Young explains, makes this responsibility a political one. No individual can impact an institution or process to the extent to which it would decrease the negative harm caused by its structures. Essentially, your personal life isn't very important, but your political life is. I would argue that Young's social connection model is a stronger system of responsibility than Kutz's complicity principle. For one, because Young correctly identifies the structural nature of these problems, and the collective means needed to combat them. And for the utilitarians amongst us, as referenced in my video on climate change and moral psychology, link in the description. One of the worst ways to convince someone to take action on climate change is to blame them personally, be it directly or indirectly, and it is more effective to have an external factor at fault, like structural injustice. This isn't to say that we all have a pass to rev our gas guzzlers and burn a couple tires, or that no one should reduce their own emissions. Of course people should. It's a good thing to do. But I would argue you aren't immoral if you don't. Something may be a good thing to do, but do you have a moral responsibility to do it? For example, it's a good thing for you to sell everything you own and only keep enough to survive and give it all away. That is a good thing and is something you probably should do. But do you have a responsibility to do it? Or in other words, are you immoral for not doing it? According to Young's argument, you wouldn't be, as long as you make the more significant action of political engagement to make structural change. So this is my argument, this is Young's argument, and this, in summary, is that individuals don't have a responsibility to reduce their own emissions, even though it's a good thing to do, but they do have a responsibility to vote for governments to actively combat climate change, because this is the best and most effective way, and the only real feasible way, of combating the structural issues which incentivize us all to make negative actions. Twitter discourse time. So after that heavy dump of political philosophy, let's get back to Twitter. A while back, the discourse was all about people's individual responsibility when it comes to climate change. And a lot of takes I saw boiled down to relatively simple utilitarian arguments, i.e., it's good for people to reduce their emissions, so they have a responsibility to do so, and if they don't, they're acting immorally. But at this point, the issue is where to stop. Like I said before, if it's a good thing to sell everything you own and give it away, why don't you? Is it immoral if you don't? Well, under a very simplistic utilitarian framework, yes. However, as evident by the earlier parts of this video, simple isn't really what we're going for. Let's apply this to a very common argument we see in the world of veganism. Someone arguing that any form of meat consumption is bad and immoral. This same issue can easily be applied to everything about you. Where are your clothes from? Who made your phone? How are the crops that you eat grown? This system of individual responsibility, much like Kutz's complicity principle, is incriminating to the point of any fault. And it is impossible for one in the world we live in to navigate their lives in any meaningful way without failing this in some way. I would argue that the arguments made are quite widely condemning. So even if you were managed to reduce it to a pretty significant degree, you'd still be acting in a significantly immoral way. Which, like I stated earlier, and like I can reference in my other video, is not the best way to go about convincing people as well. I would argue that instead of isolating individuals and focusing on their actions, it is a much better use of our time to focus on broader structural issues through collective action. This seems like a more effective and more rational way to try and solve these problems, rather than singling out random people and blaming them. The conclusion of this complicity argument is for everyone to be immoral without any realistic way of solving it, whilst the conclusion of Young's model is that systems are immoral and we all have a duty to collectively combat them. Best case scenario is that we left with a sort of vague gesture of do as much as you can to reduce your own emissions, but why wouldn't you just sell everything you have and live in the woods? That is something that you could feasibly do. Whereas Young's model gives us an actionable, feasible, and more likely effective way of solving these problems. This is a problem that I feel YouTuber and Twitter personality Movie Infidel falls into quite a lot on the Bird app, where he draws a natural and unquestioned connection between what is morally preferable and what is a moral duty, i.e. what is something you should do and what is something you have a responsibility to do. It's possible I may be misinterpreting his sort of brand of utilitarianism in this sense. However, I often feel a bit more nuance could be added when advocating for the issues that he cares about. I think that when you equivocate between what should be done and what has to be done, you get into some sort of tricky moral areas, and you can justify a lot of moral condemnation, which may be slightly misplaced, and you can fall into a lot of the issues I've brought up throughout this video. A lot of these tweets seem to morally condemn individual action, but I think that there are many issues with this, in terms of where we draw the line at, the issue of cause and effect, and if one's meat consumption is necessary or sufficient to the suffering overall, as well as the issue of the complicity principle leaving us with a not particularly actionable mindset. Once again, this might be a misinterpretation on my part. Twitter is a hellscape, and it can be hard to really get what someone means from that. However, I think taking these in abstract, the ideas that I'm criticizing, even if Mal the Infidel would not agree with my interpretation, are still valuable. You know, a much smarter individual than myself really summed this up perfectly. When the late, great Michael Brooks said, "Be kind to people, but be ruthless on systems." And, yeah. Thanks for watching. If you want more climate change content from myself, check out my video on moral psychology. The link is in the description. Also, I would recommend following me on Twitter for my great takes, at @JudalForFuture. I don't really tweet that much, but if I get some new followers, maybe I will. That would be cool. I'm trying to get better at engaging with Discourse. I'm currently terrible. Also, no hate to Mal the Infidel, of course. I just think Twitter has a fantastic ability to make every single issue into a chaotic nightmare. And I think that it somehow has a unique ability to make Discourse just painfully atrocious. Twitter is a hellscape, and nothing good comes out of it. And sometimes I think that the way he formulates his arguments can potentially feed into this, or may have led to confusion on my part. I just think that perhaps some reflection on some natural assumptions made would be interesting. See you very soon, everyone. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Hi, everyone. Just so you know, I recorded this entire video, and then upon checking my recording, the camera had messed up so that this was happening. I don't know what this glitch is, but it's really annoying. So, I've decided to challenge myself and do this video without me being on the screen. I know this is going to be difficult for a lot of you because you're all here just for my stunning good looks. However, I'm going to try my best to make this interesting in a visual way. If I fail, please just treat this like a podcast. I genuinely do think this video is good. I've never really made a video without having my camera on, so we'll see how it goes. Any tips in the description, please help me. Don't judge me. Anyway, see you around.